3,000 years ago, on a dusty plain in what we now call China, two armies faced each other across a distance that seemed both impossibly vast and terrifyingly small. One army represented the old order, a dynasty that had ruled for centuries, that had brought civilization and organization to a chaotic land that seemed permanent and eternal and unchangeable. The other army represented something new, something untested, something that existed more in the realm of hope and desperate ambition than in demonstrated fact. What happened on that plain near the city of Muye in the year 1046, before the Common Era, would determine not just which army survived, but which vision of China's future would prevail. It would spark a change so fundamental that it would reshape the entire philosophical basis of Chinese government and Chinese thought. This is the story of the Battle of Muye, and it is a story of tyranny and rebellion, of moral conviction and military genius, of the moment when an old world died and a new world was born. To understand what led to Muye, we must first look at the world that the Shang dynasty had created. The Shang were the rulers of most of China, or at least of the China that existed in the 11th century before the Common Era. They had established a sophisticated civilization with cities and writing systems, with bronze technology and religious practices, with a bureaucracy that organized society and directed its resources toward the glory and perpetuation of the Shang state. The Shang king was not merely a political leader, he was a sacred figure, a mediator between the human world and the realm of the divine. The Shang believed that the king possessed a mandate from heaven itself, that his right to rule came directly from the gods, and that his authority was absolute and inviolable. The king who ruled the Shang in the twilight years of the dynasty was known as King Zhou. But King Zhou was not a wise or capable ruler. He was, by the accounts that have come down to us, a man given to excess and indulgence, a man who squandered the resources of the state on personal pleasures, rather than on the welfare of his people or the security of his realm. He surrounded himself with sycophants and yes-men who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. He grew increasingly disconnected from the reality of what was happening in his kingdom. He ignored warnings from advisors about problems that were developing in the outlying territories. He pursued policies that were becoming increasingly unpopular with the people and with the nobility. King Zhou's behavior was not merely the failings of one individual. It represented a broader pattern of decay that was affecting the entire Shang system. The Shang nobility had grown comfortable and complacent. They took their position for granted. They believed that because their ancestors had ruled for centuries, they would continue to rule indefinitely. They did not see the danger signs that were emerging around them. They did not recognize that the very foundations of their power were beginning to crack under the weight of their own failures. On the periphery of Shang-controlled territory, in what was then considered a relatively marginal region, there existed a state called Zhou. The state of Zhou was not insignificant, but it was not one of the great powers either. It existed in a kind of subordinate relationship to the Shang, paying tribute to the Shang king and acknowledging Shang overlordship. The rulers of Zhou were capable administrators and military leaders, but they seemed content to maintain their position within the Shang system rather than attempting to challenge it directly. The situation changed with the arrival of a man named Wen Wang, who is known in Chinese history as King Wen of Zhou. King Wen was born into this world of Zhou subordination, but he possessed a vision that extended far beyond the limitations of his current position. He was intelligent, capable, and most importantly, he possessed a quality that the Shang king had lost: genuine concern for the welfare of his people and a commitment to creating a better and more just order. King Wen began to reform the administration of Zhou, to improve the welfare of its people, to strengthen its military forces, and to build alliances with neighboring states that shared his vision of a different future. Most importantly, King Wen did something that no one had done before. In quite this way, he began to articulate a new justification for political authority. He called it the mandate of heaven. According to King Wen's conception, the mandate of heaven was not an automatic inheritance that passed from father to son regardless of how the ruler behaved. Rather, it was a conditional grant from heaven that could be withdrawn if the ruler became corrupt or incompetent or lost the support of his people. In other words, King Wen was arguing that a ruler who failed to govern justly, who allowed his state to descend into disorder, who squandered his people's resources, such a ruler would lose the mandate of heaven and could justly be replaced. This was revolutionary thinking. It was a direct challenge to the idea that the Shang dynasty's rule was permanent and unchangeable. It suggested that political authority was conditional on performance, that even a dynasty that had ruled for centuries could lose its mandate if it failed in its duties. The mandate of heaven concept would become one of the most important ideas in Chinese political philosophy, and it originated with King Wen as an intellectual and moral foundation for challenging Shang authority. As King Wen strengthened Zhou, and as his vision became known, the Shang began to grow concerned. King Zhou, alarmed by reports of Zhou's growing power and influence, attempted to suppress the state through military force. He captured King Wen and imprisoned him, hoping to eliminate the threat that Zhou represented. But this action, far from crushing Zhou's ambitions, actually accelerated them. King Wen's imprisonment became a symbol of Shang tyranny and injustice. It demonstrated to everyone who was wavering about where their loyalty should lie that King Zhou was willing to use force and imprisonment against those who challenged him, that he was willing to suppress freedom and justice in order to maintain his power. King Wen died while he was still imprisoned by the Shang, before he could see the culmination of his vision. But his legacy passed to his son, a man known as King Wu of Zhou. King Wu inherited his father's vision and his father's commitment to challenging Shang authority. But King Wu also inherited something else. He inherited a coalition of states and allies that King Wen had carefully assembled, states that had become convinced that the Shang order needed to be replaced, that King Zhou's rule had become intolerable, and that the mandate of heaven had been lost. By the time King Wu came to power, the Shang dynasty was weakened. King Zhou had launched a massive military campaign against a neighboring state called the Shangren, and this campaign had required him to commit vast numbers of troops far from his capital. The campaign had been enormously costly in terms of lives and resources, and it had not resulted in a decisive victory. King Zhou's prestige and authority had been damaged by this failed military adventure. Moreover, the troops that had been committed to the campaign were now scattered and could not be quickly recalled to defend against a threat that King Zhou apparently did not even anticipate. King Wu and his advisors, particularly his strategist and uncle, the Duke of Zhou, one of the greatest military minds in Chinese history, recognized that this was their moment. They understood that the constellation of forces, the weakness of the Shang, and the commitment of allied states to their cause had aligned in a way that might never happen again. They began to make preparations for war, gathering their forces, coordinating with their allies, and preparing for the decisive confrontation that they knew was coming. The military preparations took months. Armies were gathered from Zhou and from allied states. Supplies were stockpiled. Commanders were briefed on strategy and on their roles in the coming battle. Morale among the Zhou forces was high because they believed they were fighting for a just cause, that they were liberating people from a tyrant's rule, that they were bringing the mandate of heaven to a worthy ruler. The soldiers understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, something historically significant. They were not merely fighting for territorial expansion or for the personal glory of their king. They were fighting for a vision of a better and more just order. As the Zhou forces prepared for war, they sent emissaries to the Shang court. These emissaries delivered a message to King Zhou that amounted to an ultimatum. They explained that the mandate of heaven had been withdrawn from the Shang, that King Zhou's rule had become corrupt and unjust, and that they were coming to remove him from power, and to establish a new order based on the principle of virtuous governance. The message was partly a practical communication. It gave the Shang warning of what was coming, but it was also a philosophical and moral statement. It was saying that what was about to happen was not mere rebellion or conquest, but the implementation of a higher moral principle, the restoration of proper order according to the will of heaven. King Zhou received these messages with a mixture of alarm and contempt. He did not believe that Zhou posed a genuine threat to Shang power. He had ruled the Shang for decades without any serious challenge to his authority. He commanded the most powerful state in the region. He believed that his position was secure and that any attempt to challenge him would be quickly crushed. Moreover, King Zhou's judgment was clouded by his own excesses and by the counsel of flatterers who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. His advisors assured him that the Shang army was more than capable of defeating any challenge that Zhou could mount. The armies began to move toward each other in the winter of 1046, before the Common Era. The exact routes they took and the exact timing of their movements are lost to history, but the result was that they converged on a plain near the city of Muye, not far from the Shang capital. The plain of Muye would become the stage for one of the most consequential battles in Chinese history. When the two armies faced each other at Muye, the size disparity was striking. King Zhou's Shang army consisted of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Estimates suggest somewhere between 170,000 and 700,000 men, though exact numbers are impossible to verify. The Zhou and allied forces, by comparison, consisted of perhaps 45,000 to 50,000 soldiers. The Shang army was numerically superior by a factor of somewhere between 3 and 14 times, depending on which historical estimates you accept. By any conventional military calculation, the Zhou forces should have been annihilated in the confrontation that was about to unfold. Yet the Shang forces had a critical weakness that their numbers and their reputation could not overcome. Many of the soldiers in King Zhou's army were conscripts drawn from conquered territories and from populations that had no particular loyalty to the Shang state. They were forced soldiers, fighting because they had been ordered to fight, not because they believed in the cause. Moreover, many of these soldiers had become aware, through various means, of the political claims that King Wu and the Duke of Zhou were making about the mandate of heaven and about the injustice of King Zhou's rule. Some of them had heard accounts of King Wen's imprisonment and death. Some of them knew that King Zhou was viewed as corrupt and unjust by large segments of the population. The Shang soldiers, in other words, were not confident in their cause. They did not believe that they were fighting to preserve a just and righteous order. They suspected that they were fighting to perpetuate the rule of a tyrant. And when the moment came to actually engage in combat, that lack of confidence in their cause would prove to be a more decisive factor than any number of soldiers or any military tactic. The battle began in the early morning, as the two armies lined up across from each other on the plain of Muye. The Zhou forces formed their battle lines, preparing for the assault that they knew was coming from an enemy numerically far superior to themselves. The Shang forces, confident in their numbers and their reputation, began to advance. But something extraordinary happened as the Shang soldiers moved forward toward the Zhou lines. The Shang soldiers began to lay down their weapons. They began to refuse to fight. Some accounts suggest that they actively defected to the Zhou side, turning their weapons against their own commanders. Other accounts suggest that they simply stopped fighting, that they stood passively as the Zhou forces advanced toward them. The exact details are unclear and may have been lost or distorted in the millennia since the battle occurred. But what seems clear is that King Zhou's army, despite its enormous numerical advantage, collapsed before it could deliver the overwhelming assault that it should have been capable of delivering. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. King Zhou's soldiers, the very instrument through which his power was supposed to be exercised, refused to fight for him. They voted with their weapons and their bodies, for the vision of change that King Wu represented. They chose not to defend a system that they had come to view as corrupt and unjust. In that single moment, the entire military calculation that had favored the Shang was overturned. As the Shang army collapsed, King Zhou's forces were routed. The Shang soldiers either fled from the battlefield or surrendered to the Zhou forces. Some accounts suggest that as many as 100,000 Shang soldiers were killed in the rout that followed. Other accounts suggest lower numbers, perhaps closer to 30,000 to 40,000. But whatever the exact number, the result was clear. The Shang army was utterly defeated. The military power of the Shang dynasty, which had seemed so overwhelming moments before the battle began, was completely shattered. King Zhou himself attempted to escape from the battlefield, but he found himself surrounded and without hope of rescue. Rather than submit to capture, he chose to take his own life, committing suicide as his dynasty collapsed around him. His death marked the symbolic end of Shang rule. The Shang dynasty, which had ruled for centuries, which had created one of the world's great ancient civilizations, which had seemed permanent and unchangeable, had been overthrown in a single day of battle at Muye. What followed was the establishment of the Zhou dynasty, which would rule China for the next 8 centuries, making it the longest-lasting Chinese dynasty in history. King Wu became the founding emperor of the new dynasty. The Duke of Zhou, his uncle, became one of the most important administrators of the early Zhou dynasty, helping to establish the governmental structures and policies that would define the new era. But the significance of the Battle of Muye extended far beyond the mere change of dynasties. What had happened at Muye was that a new principle of political authority had been vindicated. The idea that a ruler could be removed if he lost the mandate of heaven, that political authority was conditional on virtuous governance and the support of the people, that change and reform were possible, even when the existing order seemed permanent and unchangeable. All of these ideas had been proven in practice through the events at Muye. The mandate of heaven concept became central to how Chinese governments would think about their own legitimacy for the next 2,000 years. Every subsequent Chinese dynasty would invoke the mandate of heaven to explain why they had a right to rule. And every time a dynasty fell, the explanation given was that they had lost the mandate of heaven because they had ceased to govern justly. This concept, which originated with King Wen and which was validated through the victory at Muye, became one of the most important political ideas in all of Chinese history. The early Zhou dynasty also instituted significant reforms and changes to how the Chinese state was organized. They granted more autonomy to regional rulers while maintaining overall coordination through a feudal system. They attempted to govern based on the principle of virtue and moral example rather than through pure coercion and force. They invested in education and in the cultivation of ethical principles among their officials. These policies reflected the vision that King Wen had articulated and that King Wu had fought to implement. Yet, the Battle of Muye also reveals something profound about how historical change actually occurs. It was not superior military strategy that won the day at Muye, though the Zhou forces were ably commanded. It was not superior military tactics or superior weapons. It was not numerical superiority, which belonged overwhelmingly to the Shang. What won at Muye was superior moral authority. The Shang soldiers refused to fight for a cause they did not believe in. The Zhou soldiers fought with conviction and commitment because they believed they were fighting for something just and righteous. The collapse of the Shang army at Muye also reveals the fragility of political power that is based purely on coercion and force, without any component of genuine support or belief. King Zhou had ruled through fear and through the naked exercise of power. He had not cultivated genuine loyalty or belief in the righteousness of his cause. When the moment of testing came, when soldiers had to choose whether to fight and possibly die for his regime, they chose instead to abandon him. The soldiers of the Shang chose to bet their lives on the vision of change represented by King Wu and the Duke of Zhou, rather than to fight for the continuation of King Zhou's rule. This is a lesson that has resonated through Chinese history and beyond. Governments that rest purely on coercion and force, that do not cultivate genuine belief in their legitimacy among their people, are vulnerable to collapse when a more compelling alternative presents itself. Political authority that claims to be based on justice and virtue has a power that purely coercive authority does not. The soldiers at Muye demonstrated this truth through their actions. In the centuries that followed the Battle of Muye, the Zhou dynasty gradually weakened and fragmented. The regional rulers that had been granted autonomy under the feudal system, established by the early Zhou, gradually accumulated more and more power. Eventually, the Zhou dynasty lost the ability to maintain control over its territories. This fragmentation eventually led to the period known as the Warring States, during which various Chinese states competed for supremacy. But even as the Zhou dynasty declined and eventually fell, the concept of the mandate of heaven that it had vindicated at Muye continued to shape how Chinese political authority was understood and justified. The philosophers who emerged during the period of Zhou rule, figures like Confucius, would take the principles that King Wen had articulated and develop them further. Confucius taught that political authority should be based on virtue and moral example, that rulers had a responsibility to govern justly and to care for the welfare of their people. These teachings built directly on the foundation that had been established through the victory at Muye and the triumph of the concept of the mandate of heaven. The Battle of Muye stands as one of the most significant moments in Chinese history, because it was the moment when an old order fell and a new order was born, not through the mechanical application of military force, but through a fundamental shift in how political authority was understood and justified. It was the moment when the idea that rulers could be replaced if they lost the support of heaven and the people was proven in practice. It was the moment when millions of people chose to believe in a vision of a better future and acted on that belief by refusing to fight for the preservation of the old order. The soldiers who fought at Muye, whether they were the Zhou forces who advanced into battle or the Shang forces who laid down their weapons, were making a statement about the future. They were saying that change was possible, that the future did not have to be merely a repetition of the past, that moral principles and justice could matter more than raw power. They did not know that they were participating in an event that would shape Chinese civilization for the next 2,000 years. They did not know that the principles they were fighting for or refusing to fight against would become the intellectual foundation of how China would think about political authority and government. But in the dust and chaos of the plain of Muye, in the moment when the Shang soldiers laid down their weapons and refused to fight, something fundamental changed. An age was ending, and a new age was beginning. The old order, which had seemed permanent and unchangeable, proved to be fragile and vulnerable. The new order, which had seemed impossible and unachievable against such overwhelming odds, proved to be inevitable and irresistible. And the soldiers at Muye, through their actions and their choices, became the instruments through which history was transformed. The plain of Muye is now just another landscape in China, unremarkable to the modern traveler. But for those who understand what happened there 30 centuries ago, it remains one of the most significant battlefields in human history. It is a place where the impossible was achieved, where moral conviction triumphed over overwhelming military disadvantage, where an old world died and a new world was born. The Battle of Muye reminds us that history is not determined by numbers or by military might alone. It reminds us that ideas matter, that principles matter, that the willingness of ordinary people to choose change over the perpetuation of the status quo can reshape the entire course of civilization. And it reminds us that sometimes the most powerful force in history is not an army or a weapon, but the simple belief that a better future is possible, and the willingness of people to fight or to refuse to fight in order to bring that future into being.